Thank you very much, Graham, and thank you for inviting me. As I was saying to you, Graham, in the preamble, you'll be able to tell from my presentation that I'm not a trained historian. This is something I guess I'm dabbling in. So really, yeah, my engagement with energy as a PhD student and a postdoc, and since I moved to Edinburgh, has been engaging with kind of live contemporary policy issues, questions around what structure of an electricity market if we want to decarbonize our energy system, what role should the regulator play, and how should regulatory rules and codes and practices need to adapt in order to facilitate a transformation of the energy system. But as I was doing that, I came to the view that I didn't really understand electricity markets at all, even though I was supposed to be engaging with their redesign. And I found that there wasn't really a huge amount of work looking at the history of electricity markets and the process of creating markets and answering the question, why do electricity markets operate in different ways in different countries? You know, there's a huge amount of energy economics and policy literature comparing, I guess, the efficiency or the attributes of different markets and how markets should change, but there isn't really that kind of rich kind of background story to where the markets came from, who designed them, why they look different in different places. And I think that that type of work can help to inform the live policy, current policy debate, which is really about how should we change markets. And there's even quite a strong view amongst some energy economists that markets may not even have a role in the future, that we're going back to some kind of old style state-based model of, you know, directing the energy system and, you know, putting in kind of long-term management of the system and moving away from markets in some way. So there's a lot of uncertainty about the role of this way of governing and organizing the electricity systems. So in my own work, I've been looking at three contexts where electricity markets were introduced. And the debates really took place from the late 1980s, when ideas about from economics and market economics that they could be applied to the electricity system. It was a very controversial idea, and there was a lot of people saying, you know, it's impossible to organize the system as a market. The lights will go out, you know, the system will collapse, and they did in some places, most famously in California. So there was a period, an early period in the late 1980s of debating, engaging with these ideas. And then from the early 1990s into the mid 90s, they began to be implemented, and governments changed legislation and changed the governance of the electricity system and introduced these markets. So it's really that late 80s, early to mid 90s period which I'm looking at. So I'm looking at England and Wales. At the time, the Scottish electricity system was less integrated as part of a British system as it is now. So that case study is looking at England and Wales. Also, Norway was one of the early countries to go down the route of changing its system and introducing markets around the same time. And then at the EEC level, so looking at the European Economic Community as it was then, and particularly core Europe, so the French and German system. So it was much more, there was much more of a pushback in those contexts against the idea of a market, and it took quite a long time for the EEC countries to agree, you know, a mutually agreed process for implementing markets in the EU, EEC member states as they were then. So those are the three contexts that I'm looking at, and it's over that time frame. So it's about 30 years ago. So I think, you know, it's time to start thinking about markets now in historical terms, as we think about their role in the future. So just a bit of an outline. I want to emphasize that the markets, of course, were highly politicized. It was a very political process of designing and implementing these markets. And I look at that and try and tell that story in two ways. So first is looking at, I guess, addressing the question of why did this transition towards markets happen at a similar time across these different contexts. So I think there were kind of international broader trends in energy economics, in changes in technology, and in terms of the international energy markets, which were of course influencing all of these contexts. And I think that those trends, as I will explain, began to kind of destabilize or undermine the kind of established logics of the electricity systems and the regimes which govern them, particularly the established relationship between the state and the electricity industry in European countries. But then another important feature of the story is that, you had these kind of broad international trends, but the debate and the process of creating the markets and the way the markets were introduced and the way they evolved happened in very different ways in the different cases. So, we need to explain those kind of more situated processes of marketization, the politics at the local level, who were the actors kind of influencing change in different countries, what were the kind of more specific networks and debates and the politics of the processes. To illustrate some of these dynamics, I'll talk about the British case, so introducing the first electricity market in England and Wales in 1990. And then I'll reflect a bit on the last slide about some, how this might be relevant to the current debate. So thinking about those international trends which undermined the kind of, the established economic logic of the systems as they had developed really in the post-war decades, very strong state control, in some cases in the UK, in France as well, nationalized, national ownership. These are national electricity companies. In Germany, there was very strong legislation which provided regional utilities monopoly protection. So there was basically a legal ban on competition between utilities. So they were kind of protected monopolies. So across all of these cases, there was a very strong role for the state in regulating the system, in structuring these utilities as monopolies. But international trends in economics, in technological changes, and in energy markets, I think, undermined this kind of economic logic of the system as it was. So really from the late 1970s, when the Iranian Revolution and the huge jump in oil prices during the 1970s, there was an established or embedded kind of policy set of assumptions in European nations that, we need to protect ourselves from these very volatile international factors, forces, this volatility, and, we're too reliant on imports. So the policy narrative really became centered around promoting self-sufficiency, support for domestic industries through subsidies to the coal industry and the nuclear industry, and that kind of idea of national autonomy and energy security was very strong. But that began to be undermined, particularly as the oil price really collapsed from the early to mid 1980s. So if you see on the right, the graph of the oil price falls during the 1980s. There was a lot of cheap coal coming on stream in the international markets from Colombia, from Australia, from the United States coming into Europe. And this was obviously cheaper than the domestic sources, particularly in Britain and Germany. And at the same time, there was processes of globalization and economic changes and a lot of concerns amongst the European industrialized nations about industrial competitiveness, and that high energy prices were driving away industry out of Europe. And there was a strong pro-market lobby which emerged in the 1980s amongst the amongst the industries. And they made that argument that we need to be able to access cheap sources of energy. We're being saddled with these subsidies to domestic coal and nuclear. We need to be able to break free to make choices in the market to make ourselves competitive. At the same time, there was a large supply side overhang. There was a lot of excess electricity production in Europe, particularly in France. So Electricité de France was actually one of the very early kind of proponents of moving towards free trade and markets in electricity. Very shortly after, once they realized that this would involve a dismantling of their national monopoly in France, they turned against markets. But early on, they were pushing strongly for it because they had a lot of excess nuclear capacity in France. Economic growth was slowing down in the 1970s and 80s. Economies were less energy intensive. So there was a lot of excess production, and this created a kind of momentum or an argument behind, pushing for more trade across borders in Europe. And then another economic relationship which broke down was the one between economies of scale and the size of electricity generation units. So because of the development of new technologies, particularly more efficient gas turbines, the idea that ever larger electricity generation units delivered cheaper electricity per unit, there was a kind of a relationship in terms of economies of scale that drove the momentum of the system, as Thomas Hughes talks about. That relationship began to break down. So these factors, I think, and these trends kind of undermined the established regime, the established idea that the state kind of controls and directs the electricity system. But this played out in very different ways, and just to highlight that, some points about how this unfolded in England and Wales. The picture on the right is of an economist called Stephen Littlechild, who was a very influential actor throughout the process of liberalisation and creating markets in Britain. He was an academic economist at the University of Birmingham. He was making arguments about this kind of post-war Keynesian idea of the mixed economy, of nationalised industries. This is really a bad idea. We need to move towards more markets and competition. And he was drawing on Austrian economic theories from Joseph Schumpeter and Ludwig von Mises, making this case for competition and that this could be applied to nationalised industries like gas and electricity and water. At the time, when people look back now at the British case, often the privatization issue is often emphasized. And of course, that was a big change, the switch from nationalized to privatized industry. But at the time, during the debate in the late 1980s, the really contentious idea was competition. So the idea that you could have consumers making choices in the market about who should supply them, and you have different utilities competing for the same customers. This was a radically new idea, although it's kind of normalized for us now. It was really contentious, and people within the industry almost couldn't believe that this would be possible. They just thought the lights would go out and the system would collapse. So that kind of basic argument for competition had to be made by people like Stephen Littlechild. So he made alliances within the Department of Energy and their electricity division, developed relationships with the civil servants, and they began to look at the effects of competition on the system. So this kind of new network, that was arguing and making the case for competition, began to grow in influence. But in the UK, in the British case, there was a clear trade-off between the extent of competition and the need to protect the nuclear and the coal industries. Because if competition was introduced overnight, the coal industry would collapse. 100,000 people would lose their jobs. The nuclear industry wouldn't be able to survive in a competitive environment. So there had to be a trade-off between the drive for competition and, I guess, the political need to protect kind of domestic industries. So competition had to be phased in over the 1990s, and that was about a political trade-off. And Littlechild himself became an advisor to Cecil Parkinson, the Secretary of State for Energy. And then afterwards, he became the energy regulator. So throughout this process, it was almost a case of performativity of his economic ideas and putting them into practice. So that case of Littlechild and the British case highlights, this was a very localized process with actors. It was a situated process of socio-technical change in itself, a process of innovation and discovery, because people didn't really know how these markets would work, and the ideas that were being put forward in the early phases in the early 80s were quite different from what actually emerged and how the markets came into being and how they actually worked. So it was kind of a process of innovation and discovery in itself. And in order to help me to think about that, I draw on work by Kaliskan and Callan, actor network theorists, who talk about the creation of markets as this kind of a socio-technical innovation process. And they talk about, ideas like heterogeneous networks, that we need to think about economists and consultants and political actors, and how economic ideas and studies and models are brought together into these networks and how they exert change, and the kind of conflict between different rival networks which shape the politics of markets. In my cases, I think some of the key trade-offs that happened were, and the key decisions that had to be made were, who would have choice in the market? So initially in the British case and in Europe, it was only the large industrial consumers that were allowed to make choices in the market, and domestic consumers had to wait during a transition period into the late 1990s before they were allowed as such to become, participants in the market. So there was a kind of a formatting of who would become marketized and how these new customers in the market would be created. The big question of how to deal with the incumbent industries was a big political question. How to maintain coal and nuclear industries, and the switch to competition overnight, was seen to be detrimental to those industries. So there had to be a slow process or a transition towards markets. And then how to configure, in a more technical sense, the relationship between the market and the system. So how to balance the system in terms of maintain its frequency, and also in terms of dealing with congestion on the network and the kind of the physical flow of electricity. So there had to be a new kind of demarcation between the operation of the market and the operation of the system. So some of the points I think that are relevant to the work that what people are talking about today about redesigning markets, there is clearly a lot of disruption again at the international level in terms of economic change, oil price volatility, low-cost technologies, renewables this time coming onto the scene, quite similar to the early to mid-1980s. And this is disrupting, kind of established relationships in terms of systems. So there are new discussions about the future of markets. I've highlighted the International Energy Agency's report, Repowering Markets, which is a very good overview of the kind of current policy debate. So there's a lot of talk about how to value things other than energy. So the established electricity markets are about valuing energy. What is the cheapest form of generation to meet demand? But now we're seeing a hybridization of markets. We're seeing other attributes of generation being valued. So capacity, the capacity to ensure security of supply. There's new markets developing around that. Service, around flexibility, around locational benefits, alleviating constraints on the network. So there's quite a hybridization of different. So there's a market framework, but there's a lot of different kind of sub-markets underneath that developing. Key questions are, what is to be valued? Is it just about energy, or are there other attributes, economic attributes that need to be valued, like flexibility and capacity and energy security? And in this process of revaluation and remarketization of the system, how are risks and costs being allocated? Who are the winners and losers of this process? So I think that's one of the key questions that I think histories and more theoretically informed kind of critical studies of electricity systems and technologies and markets can help to inform that type of debate. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.